My name is Professor Meg Penrose, and I teach at Texas Wesleyan School of Law. Today I have the privilege of discussing women's suffrage with you. Women's suffrage is a fancy way of describing the right of women to vote in elections, state or federal. For many of you, and for me, women have always had the right to vote. It is easy for us to take this important right for granted, or to assume that this right has always existed. But women did not always have the right to vote, or the right to go to college, or to enter contracts, or to sit on juries, or to own property, or even to become lawyers or doctors. Historically, women have been the last minority group to gain their rights, whether we are talking about the right to own land, to enter contracts on their own, or the right to vote. Today we will focus on how women secured one of the most important rights in a democratic society, the right to vote. The struggle to gain the right to vote began in earnest in July 1848, when a large group of abolitionist women and a few men met in Seneca Falls, New York. Abolitionists were individuals dedicated to ending slavery. The Seneca Falls Convention was organized by two abolitionist women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. These ladies met by accident in England at the World Anti-Slavery Convention when both were attending the convention with their husbands. The pair became interested in women's suffrage and equality when they were precluded from speaking or serving as delegates at the convention due solely to their gender. This chance meeting and exclusion from full participation at the Anti-Slavery Convention inspired the women to organize the Seneca Falls Convention. Other famous abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, attended the Seneca Falls Convention and signed on to the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions presented at the Seneca Falls Convention. The Declaration of Sentiments was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a wife and mother of 7 children. The Declaration included 11 resolutions, most notably the right for women to vote and participate in government. Ms. Stanton patterned the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions after the Declaration of Independence, even beginning the document with the very familiar sounding, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This similarity to the Declaration of Independence was intentionally designed as an attempt to highlight the history of man's tyranny over women. In particular, Ms. Stanton emphasized that men have never permitted women to vote, and thereby had compelled women to submit to laws that she had no voice in drafting or approving. Another staunch abolitionist, Susan B. Anthony, would soon become a vital part of the women's suffrage movement. Ironically, Ms. Anthony became aligned with the women's suffrage movement in the same way that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott had become involved. She was attending a New York State temperance convention and was precluded from speaking. Ms. Anthony was advised that ladies had only been invited to the convention to listen and to learn, but had no right to speak. This experience motivated Susan B. Anthony to dedicate herself to women's suffrage and equality issues. 3 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met at an anti-slavery meeting in Seneca Falls, New York. This meeting led to the strong friendship between the two women that ultimately can be credited with securing women's suffrage. Beginning in 1869 and continuing through 1906, Susan B. Anthony appeared before every U.S. Congress to argue for women's suffrage. Her efforts were unsuccessful, but kept the issue fresh on legislators' minds. Shortly after the Civil War, women's suffragists were dealt a considerable blow. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which secured the right for black males and freed slaves to vote, excluded women from its text. The 15th Amendment, ratified on February 3, 1870, gave African American males the right to vote in theory, but barriers remained in place, preventing both women and black Americans from voting for many years. Many southern states passed poll taxes and literary tests to preclude African American males from capitalizing on the promise of the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. The full voting rights of many African Americans would not be realized until 1965, long after women received their suffrage, when President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. Still, women's suffrage would not be realized for a full 50 years after the passage of the 15th Amendment. A great struggle continued for women seeking voting rights between 1870 and 1920, when the 19th Amendment finally gave women the right to vote. During this 50-year span, there were demonstrations, riots, picketing, parades, hunger strikes, and infighting, even among those groups dedicated to women's suffrage and equality. One of the most renowned events included the arrest, indictment, and conviction of Susan B. Anthony for casting an illegal vote in the 1872 national election. Acting on the advice of her attorney, Miss Anthony cast a ballot in the election and was jailed, found guilty of knowingly casting an illegal vote, and ultimately fined by Judge Ward Hunt for her behavior. Miss Anthony, an activist, hoped her case, United States versus Susan B. Anthony, would reach the United States Supreme Court, but it never did. Instead, she petitioned Congress to reverse her conviction because she believed she was denied the constitutional right to trial by jury. Although both houses of Congress referred Anthony's position issue of women's suffrage in the 1875 case, Minor versus Happersett. Virginia Minor sought to vote in the 1872 election, much like Susan B. Anthony, and tried to register in her home state of Missouri. Happersett, the Register of Voters, refused Minor's request. The Missouri State Constitution limited voting to male citizens. Miss Minor challenged that her preclusion violated the 14th Amendment Privileges and Immunities Clause. A unanimous Supreme Court disagreed with her and denied her relief. Thus, the Supreme Court made clear that the existing U.S. Constitution did not grant women any right to vote. Women's suffrage, it appeared after Minor versus Happersett, would require a constitutional amendment. Sadly, many of those that initiated the fight for women's suffrage, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, would not live to see their work fulfilled. Instead, under the continuing efforts of other suffragists, Congress finally passed a joint resolution that will become the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The resolution passed the House by a vote of 304 to 89, and the Senate by a vote of 56 to 25. Under Article 5 of the United States Constitution, constitutional amendments may be proposed by Congress when 2/3 of each House agree on the amendment. The joint resolution that would eventually become the 19th Amendment read, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin were the first 3 states to ratify the 19th Amendment. Tennessee was the last. Thus, in August 1920, when Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, millions of women were legally able to vote in the 1920 national election. The fight for women's suffrage was long, but ultimately successful. It is this amendment that permits me, and permitted my mother, my grandmothers, to vote. Only by voting, the suffragists believe, do we have a voice in the laws that govern us. Many women and minorities take the right to vote for granted, but this right, amazingly, is still less than 100 years old. Vote. We all owe it to those that fought tirelessly to secure the right for all Americans. Thank you.